Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the week of May 25th. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm joined by Josh Blank today, the Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. How was your Memorial Day, Josh?
Restful and stable at home, I guess.
Well, but hopefully at least a little bit recreational as well.
A little recreational. Not as much as some people, I don't think.
Well, yeah, so it would seem. So as we come out of that Memorial Day weekend, we want to talk about at least a couple of things. First, we want to talk about partisanship and views of the coronavirus and the efforts to contain it here in Texas. Then we'll talk a little bit about the ongoing fight over expanding Texans' ability to vote by mail and how partisanship is shaping that, too. In some ways, the second discussion should fall out of the first just a little bit. So let's start a little bit with partisanship and Texas attitudes toward the virus. This has been a topic that has dominated political discussion nationwide and to a lesser degree, but still evident in the state, for at least the last month and a half. I mean, it was percolating almost from the beginning of the pandemic as we saw some evidence that people with different political predispositions were looking differently, not only at the virus, but perhaps even more so at how governments were responding at different levels, from the national government down to the state to the local level. A lot of this really came to a head over this 3-day holiday weekend as we saw images from beaches and parties all over the country, of some beaches and some places seeming to be trying and with some effectiveness respecting social distancing efforts to contain the virus. Other places, probably more prominent in media coverage, decidedly not doing that. Texas got in on that in a couple of different ways, and at least in the broadcasts I saw footage from the beach at Port Aransas of people kind of wall to wall with not seeming to be making the effort at social distancing. But there were things from all over the country. Now, at the state level, this really comes on the heels of the governor's consistent movement in the last month towards trying to reopen Texas for business. And, there's kind of a long trajectory there in terms of how the governor has approached this. Initially, the governor got heat from both sides, if we go back to mid-March, from the left for moving too slowly, from the right for moving too decisively, and he was initially seeming to try to balance that to some extent. He's still trying to balance that, but it's hard not to draw the conclusion that he is now leaning much more towards pushing an opening of the state. And this has really brought out even further this notion of partisanship. Josh, we were principals along with Darren Shaw and our partners at the Texas Tribune on doing the first poll in Texas in mid-April, early to mid-April, I suppose, in which we tried to figure out what Texans were thinking about this. And why don't you talk a little bit about the first round of things we found?
Well, I think the first thing, to highlight here is that, Texans as a whole were overwhelmingly concerned about the coronavirus. It jumped to the top of the most important problems facing the state and the country, displacing, sort of long-standing issues. The vast majority of Texans, perceive the coronavirus as a significant crisis or at the very least a major problem. But as you've already highlighted, I mean, there are major differences based on partisanship. And this in and of itself is not necessarily surprising. We're used to seeing differences of opinion based on whether people identify as Democrats or Republicans, but it's much more rare for those differences to sort of manifest themselves so quickly, I think, in felt policy. And I think this weekend is an example of felt policy, right? I mean, if we're talking about some sort of major piece of legislation around healthcare, it's going to take, months, if not years, to work its way through the process. And then it's going to get, let's say it gets passed, it gets signed, it takes a while for it to be implemented by the bureaucracy and all these things. And by the time you actually maybe feel the effect of a law, it's actually, years later and only really a small part of it. Whereas, Memorial Day weekend, if you see these partisan differences emerging in terms of, Republicans on the one hand, more anxious to see the economy reopened and more concerned about the economy than the virus, whereas you have Democrats significantly more concerned about the virus than the economic impact of containing it. So in that April poll, we're thinking about some of the constraints that the governor is facing from Republican voters in Texas. A majority of Republicans said that the bigger threat to the U.S. came from keeping people at home for too long, as opposed to only about a third of Republicans who thought that the bigger threat came from not keeping people at home long enough. So even back in April, a majority of Republicans were looking to the end of this and saying, we can't go too long than is absolutely necessary. And then you can combine this with the fact that the belief that among Republicans that the virus either will be contained enough to resume normal activities in the next few months, or has already been contained enough, or is already contained, that adds even further still to the impatience amongst Republicans. So going to that, looking a little more specifically at that number, 85% of Republicans said that the virus either has been contained or will be contained within the next month or so, and that was in April, and now we're almost into June. 47% believe that the virus would be contained within the next few weeks or was already contained in that April poll. So what you have is you have a majority of Republicans saying, the virus is contained or just about contained, are concerned about being at home for too long, and are significantly more concerned about the economy. And that's, at least from the bottom up, I think where the governor is reacting and sort of the impatience that he, to some extent, is channeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this really underlines the kind of circular dynamic of public opinion and political leadership, and how partisanship is just fueling. It's like wind blowing this wheel that just keeps going round and round. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that I probably hadn't really thought about it on a timeline as much until we were just going over this. That as we've seen more and more pressure in the public sphere and in news coverage, and a lot of this is anecdotal, but that anecdotal pressure from Republicans does have a basis in public opinion, and the timeline was kind of telegraphed when, in the poll data. If 47% of Republicans thought either it was contained already or would be contained within the next few weeks, we're now just past the next few weeks time frame of, what people were responding to in that poll. Now, you and I have written some stuff, and I think it's one of the things that I've been interested in all along is that this discussion has been going on not just as people, on a large basis are trying to figure out when it's safe to go out of their homes and when it's safe to go back to work, and per the weekend, when it's safe to actually be around other people and get out and enjoy yourself. It's also been going on in the context of very high profile protests, some in Texas, some somewhat larger in other states. Michigan has been the most prominent one, maybe, in which folks that are really fundamentally against the stay-at-home orders have been protesting loudly and publicly against these policies. But, and that's been taken in as a real sign of impatience. But I think if you look beneath that media coverage and beneath that impatience, there's still a core belief among these same Republicans that the pandemic requires a serious public policy response. So in that same poll that you were citing data from a minute ago, 81% of Republicans supported requiring a mandatory 14-day self-quarantine for anyone exposed to the virus. Now, they're still also ready for business to resume, but nonetheless, another number from that poll, 69% of Republicans supported the stay-at-home order as of early to mid-April. So, we're still seeing that the lion's share of Republicans are, aware and cognizant of the severity of the pandemic. And we even found that, more than half were still leaving their residences only when they had to. And a small share, 5%, said they weren't leaving home at all. So there is a real struggle here going on, I think.
Yeah, it's a really fine line to walk, right? I mean, I think honestly, it is the, not sort of like it's not normatively the correct line. I'm not saying, and it's certainly not necessarily what public health officials would caution, but you start to look at these public opinion numbers and you look at the path that the governor has created for himself moving forward, and it all makes a lot of sense. He's got, pressure from, basically the wrong side of a majority of his constituents to open up the state sooner than later, but also at the same time, real concern among those same constituents about the impact of the virus. And so, one of the, so I think in and of itself, that creates a certain amount of pressure that's guiding this path forward. And in some ways, I think you highlighted, even guiding the timeline. I mean, the degree to which the governor's own timeline lined up with the perception of Republican constituents in the state about, how long it would take for the virus to be contained is somewhat uncanny. But I think you make a broader point that is driving me a little crazy in the news coverage of all this, is that you really have a very, very tiny share of Texans and really Americans who are sitting back and saying, basically, for lack of a better way to put it, this is all BS, right? I mean, but for the most part, people, Democrats, Republicans, Independents understand the seriousness of this and have been supportive of most of the efforts made to contain the worst consequences of this virus, even if they're getting antsy about the economy. It's only a small share of Texans in particular in this case, but I think Americans in general, who are actually, who we would say are the broader group represented by these maskless people showing up at state capitals with guns.
Yeah, or, showing up at places and, arguing, berating people
Right.
wearing masks or kicking because they're asked to wear a mask or whatever. And I can accept that that's a moving target,
Sure.
and that maybe, hopefully we'll have more data soon to see how much that number is changing. The, national tracking does show that, we are seeing movement in which more people, this impatience we're talking about, more people are getting more impatient and, voting with their feet, if you will, based on that impatience. But I think, this really does come back to a fairly traditional aspect of talking about politics, and that is, what kind of cues people are getting from leadership. And that is also such a deeply partisan factor now. I mean, the truth of the matter is, you were talking about a minute ago, Governor Abbott balancing pressure from his constituents and the degree to which he's got a majority of constituents, at least certainly in the early phases of this, who, as we've said, took this seriously. And then there's these very noisy constituents that are getting a lot of media coverage because they're, frankly, causing conflict, and that plays well.
Now, show
But the
up with
other
a gun
piece
to
of
a
this-
state capitol, right? You'll get some
Right,
media coverage.
exactly. It's a pretty good visual, right? Or yell at there's like a mini genre on social media of reporters showing up to cover openings wearing masks, and then lots of people without masks sitting there yelling, or a crowd of people sitting there yelling at them. And we don't have much context, like how frequently this is happening, etc. But the other piece of this that we haven't talked about yet, but which is critical, particularly for Republicans, is that you have the president acting as an exemplar and a model of behavior and as somebody that is providing very powerful partisan cues. And it's hard not to imagine that as long as the president's job approval numbers continue to hold up among Republicans, which they have, that won't continue to move the needle among, an increasing number of Republicans.
Well, and further, I mean, it also constrains what the governor is able to do, just as much as that his constituents constrain sort of the realm of what's possible in terms of, how the governor is going to go about responding to the virus. The reality is that Abbott can't take a position too far from the president on any of this, and he's chosen not to. And the truth is, I mean, he can look around to the rest of the country and to governors, even Republican governors, who have made decisions at odd with the president's line on the virus, and they are quickly and unceremoniously kicked, usually on social media, by the president for their lack of fealty to him. And the reality is Abbott has not done that, and the sort of the byproduct of that has been a ton of praise from the president for Texas's handling, in particular Abbott's handling of the virus. Now, Abbott is technically his job approval rate in Texas is higher than the president's when it comes to the coronavirus, but the reality is, as you already said, the president is extremely, extremely popular among Texas Republicans, has remained so during the entirety of his presidency. And, there's really little to be gained for Abbott by creating any sort of wedge between he and the president, especially when he's getting, support from, again, his constituents in particular to move forward with the reopenings similar to what the president wants.
Yeah, I mean, I think to be fairish, I mean, I think that not entirely fair, but fairish, the governor's political opponents, of course, would say that, those are all political judgments on his part, and that, if he wanted to, I mean, if it, they would couch it and have couched it as a matter of political courage, in terms of his willingness to take on the president and spend some of his political capital. But I think, what you say is right, and that, it's a huge political risk for a governor that has not shown himself to be, particularly inclined to be a risk taker. And so, he has taken this tact. That said, there's risk on the other side here, in that if this policy direction of opening, even though the numbers in Texas are mixed in terms of infection rate, testing, all of these things,
new cases, etc.
There is political risk if for some reason hotspots do wind up happening around the state, and it's just a big unknown. There's uncertainty there. Now, I would say that to transition to our next topic, one area where there is in fact less uncertainty, and more certainty is the politics surrounding voting by mail. And this was really one of the hot topics in the state's political circles in the week leading into the holiday weekend. It's a national issue, and that is the idea that there are provisions in Texas law that allow voters to cast their votes by mail under certain circumstances. So the state law in Texas is that Texans can seek an absentee ballot that they can fill out at home and mail in if they're 65 years or older, have a disability or an illness, if they're going to be out of the country during the election period, or they're going to be confined in jail but not convicted in a way that would otherwise disqualify them.
I just want to correct something. I think you said out of the country, out of the county where they reside.
Oh yeah, out of the county. Sorry, you're right.
No.
So
okay, sorry.
No, that's good. So if given that given the conditions of the virus, there's been a concerted movement, again, mainly by Democrats and allied groups, to expand mail-in voting opportunities for Texans based on the idea that showing up to vote on a crowded election day poses a health risk because you'd be there standing in line and, going through the voting process. And in terms of predictability, this has been fought tooth and nail by Texas state government with Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, playing the role that we would expect an elected attorney general to play, leading the fight against this. And it's been, a huge partisan piece that really is familiar to all of us based on partisan fights over voting in the past, right?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, what has tended to be the case, at least in the last, we'd say probably about 15 years, has been concerted efforts by Republicans to, as they would put it, shore up the election system to make it, safer and more reliable and to avoid voter fraud. Democrats would frame those efforts as attempts at voter suppression and, limiting the extent to which people can vote. And this is, and this has been these patterns have actually been, incorporated by voters on both sides. And I mean, we've watched this over time, in terms of a lot of different sort of public opinion fights where, basically something gets proposed as a potential change to the voting system. Voter ID is the most obvious one. And people say at first, well, that seems okay. Don't I use this to vote? And then as time goes on, and sort of the partisan elements into it mix, we start saying, oh, well, we're going to include, in voter ID, we're going to include, concealed carry licenses, but not college IDs. And then people start to say, well, wait a second, what is this about? And then people start to kind of get into their partisan camps. Now, the reality is that that's actually sort of automatic now. I think that's sort of so built into the cake that, at least in most of the polling that we see, even with a new issue here, like this idea about mail-in voting. I mean, when we polled on mail-in voting in April of this year, specifically as a response to the coronavirus, so expanding mail-in voting, I mean, one of the things you find 86% of Democrats in favor and 59% of Republicans were opposed. And this was even really before the discussion began. And the reason I'm talking about the discussion is just because the discussion is what gives people and voters a sense of sort of where they might land on an issue that they don't know a lot about. So if you hear John Cornyn and Greg Abbott and the president talking about the ills of mail-in voting and you're a Republican, well, that gives you a signal that maybe you should be against mail-in voting. And likewise, if you hear Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi talking about suppressing the vote and, that people should be allowed to vote by mail, then for Democrats, that's a signal that this is probably something they should be in favor of. But even early in this discussion, partisanship already colored this. And there's been a lot of articles, sort of over the last couple of weeks in this national discussion about, sort of what do Republicans have against mail-in voting and all this sort of kind of speculative pieces. But honestly, it's not totally complicated. And I guess I should say something that maybe goes back to one of our first podcasts, Jim, which is just to remind people, voting rules aren't handed down from on high to us. And I think if you think about sort of voting in this country, if you know anything about it over time or even in contemporary life, it's not as though our voting system is set up to maximize turnout. If it was, we'd have compulsory, we'd have automatic registration, we could have compulsory voting, we could have weekend voting, all these things, give a voting holiday, all these things that we don't have and choose not to have, among all kinds of other historical antecedents. In this particular case, the thing to really focus on here is just kind of some of the basic numbers, which is Texas is becoming a more competitive state. And if we look at our polling, and in particular, I'm looking at sort of the average party identification, so how people identify as a Democrat or Republican or as an independent. So if I average across the last 14 surveys we've conducted from February of 2016 to April 2020, registered voters over 65 are significantly more likely to identify as Republicans, 56% to 34% who identify as Democrats. Among voters under the age of 65, it's about 45% Democrat and about 44% Republican. Ultimately, and as you get younger still, those groups will become more and more Democratic. And so at its core, expanding mail-in voting among Republicans expanding mail-in voting in Texas is not something that is likely to net Republicans significantly more votes in the short run. And going back to sort of the same set of numbers, we could look at a trial ballot, basically. Would you vote for Donald Trump or Joe Biden if the election was held today? In that same April poll, Trump was ahead 49-44. Among those over 65, Trump was ahead 58% to 39%. Amongst those under 65, Trump was only ahead 47% to 45%. And so ultimately, there's just little incentive for Republican elected officials in a state that's becoming increasingly competitive. If you remember, in 2018, Ted Cruz only beat Beto O'Rourke by 2.5 percentage points. There's not a lot of incentive to really extend this, to a broader group of people.
Right. And so I think that, where you started there, you connect that really to the, one would be forgiven for listening to this and finding it, a fundamentally cynical read that says that this is really about incentives to maximize votes. But I think, your point, the point where we started that discussion has to be sort of underlined that, there's always rhetoric that appeals to higher principles in these discussions about voting and the degree to which voting is made harder or easier, or in the historical context, whether the franchise is expanded more or contracted. And that's always at play here. And it's ultimately kind of naive to think that it's not. And so, this has been going on in the courts over, the last couple of months. The Democrats and allied groups, to underline the kind of partisan piece of this, started taking court action a couple of months ago now to try to ensure that the vote by mail provisions would be expanded and available to everybody, given the conditions of the pandemic. They've been, active in both federal and state court. In federal court, they got a really big win in mid-May, that when a federal district judge issued a very strongly worded ruling in favor of the Democrats, saying that it was fundamental and that this was a constitutional issue per the Democratic lawsuit. That was appealed and was blocked almost immediately from being implemented by a federal appeals court panel. In state court, the Democrats argued slightly differently within the rubric of state law, that the Texans election code's provision for, sickness or physical condition being one of the reasons that you could request a mail-in ballot should apply to anyone that was vulnerable to the virus, which is obviously a fairly broad category of people, effectively everyone. The state argued that this was, too narrow. Again, the Democrats won in a lower court by an elected judge known to be democratically aligned. It was then affirmed, a little more surprisingly, I think, at the appeals court level in Texas. Shortly thereafter, the Attorney General got the state Supreme Court to issue an order blocking election officials from implementing mail-in ballots. That's where it stands as of now. I would expect there's actually going to be more action this week on this, with a lot of people expecting that this will make it to the Supreme Court. Texas probably won't be the only case, I suspect, should that happen. But there's a real time factor here too, because the immediate kind of object of this is the runoff elections that are scheduled in mid-July. But the larger game afoot here, obviously, is the general election in November, should the pandemic still be in play, which a lot of people expect it will, but is, again, a big unknown. So, we'll stay in touch on this and keep an eye on it. But it's really going to be a case that's, again, going to come out of Texas that's likely going to have national consequences.
Yeah, and Jim, you alluded to me I don't think you called me a cynic, but you alluded to someone might consider us, or me at least, to be a cynic because, sort of laying out these attitudes. But ultimately, I'll say this, I'm actually pretty far from being a cynic. I'm kind of agnostic in a lot of this, which is that, attitudes exist. People have them, people have these opinions, and it's kind of hard to say, look, objectively, 40, 50, 100% of people can be wrong about something. That's true. But it doesn't mean they don't believe these things. And ultimately, the things that we're talking about when we're talking about voting here and the sanctity of the election system, the security, are beliefs. And they're not even just beliefs, they're beliefs about what is going to happen in an upcoming election. And I think some of our previous polling kind of illustrates sort of the divergence of beliefs that are driving sort of people's either support for or resistance to expanding voting. And I'll just touch on them really quickly. In June of 2016, we asked how often voters think that other voters knowingly break election laws in Texas. Among Democrats, only 9% said that this happens frequently. So again, I think there was, that never happens, not very often, sometimes frequently. Only 9% of Democrats said that people knowingly break elections laws frequently, compared to 30% of Republicans. So almost 1 in 3 Republicans in the state thinks that there is some kind of fraud going on frequently. How often do you think that people who are not U.S. citizens vote in Texas elections? 8% of Democrats think that happens frequently. 47% of Republicans thinks that happens frequently. On the other side, how often do Texans think that people who are eligible to vote in a Texas election are prevented from doing so? Among Democrats, 31% thinks this happens frequently. Among Republicans, only 5% believe this is a frequent occurrence. So ultimately, there's an underlying perception here about the current, sanctity of our electoral process that is just extremely different. Now, I should say at this point, as every article that you could ever read about this would say, there's almost no evidence of any sort of systemic or widespread voter fraud in Texas or elsewhere now or over time. But having said that, these beliefs exist. And again, this isn't a cynical, this is just an observation. If these beliefs exist, and do you believe that the election system is sort of constantly under threat from, for different forms of malfeasance, that's a reason to be reluctant towards expanding access to the vote.
Well, I feel like I should have issued a trigger warning with that statement, I guess, but I was really talking more about the elites than public opinion, though, the reality of public opinion plays into that. I think it's, when I was thinking that some people might think this was cynical, I was thinking more of their expectations of leadership rather than the reality of what's out there in the attitudes. And the argument that, political leaders might be trying to maximize their own positions rather than, either exploiting and fueling those attitudes rather than, trying to, expand the franchise, protect the sanctity of the electoral process.
Well, luckily, cynicism towards elites is broad and widely accepted, so we can do that.
Right. Okay, and with that, I think we'll call this one to a close. Thanks a lot, and we'll be back next week with another second reading. Thanks to Josh, and thanks to all our technical and support staff in the Liberal Arts Development Studio at the University of Texas at Austin. Have a good, safe week, and we'll talk to you next week. The Second Reading Podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.